We are so inclined here in the West to think of the aggressive individual as expressing the highest attainments of the race, that we look upon the quiet man as weak, as negative, as an escapist. We no longer reward the person who has achieved internal integrity or tranquility. Viewing tranquility with alarm under a system which apparently reserves its greatest rewards for continuous activity, we have come to a situation which perhaps calls for a re-evaluation of what might be termed a normal point of view. Obviously, the human being cannot engage in continuous activity. That he can be active, we all realize, but he cannot be active 24 hours a day. Nature has therefore indicated that a certain time or period of tranquility is absolutely necessary to survival. It presses this upon us in the form of sleep. And sleep, to a very great degree, is man's salvation. By means of it, he is able to repair some of the excessive damage caused by activity. We must therefore recognize that it is perfectly conceivable that the machinery of man is subject to two ultimates. One, that it will wear out, and the other, that it will rot out. When man's machinery wears out, we have what might be termed a normal state of affairs. The body and the structure is such that it must ultimately wear out. However, if a machine is neglected or is not given a certain amount of rest, it will wear out prematurely. It will wear out through neglect, through indifference, through failure to make necessary small repairs when they become obvious, and it will wear out if it is not built of the best possible materials. The same machine will rot out or be destroyed by rust and decay unless it is properly used, unless it is given a certain amount of activity, and unless it is kept clean and properly oiled. Thus, somewhere in the middle distance between absolute activity and utter inertia is the area of greatest efficiency. In this area, the individual uses but does not abuse his resources. He learns how to work and he learns how to rest. He learns how to use the different faculties with which he has been endowed. We learn this principle also from experience in the lower grades of public school. We find that students cannot continue to think about one subject throughout a school day without extraordinary fatigue. They can, however, quickly bring new faculties into play, and by taking a number of different courses, spending an hour, say, for each, they will come through the day with very slight indication of fatigue. They have had variety, they have had change of mind, and change is a kind of rest in itself. It gives certain faculties opportunity to rest, brings others into activity, and preserves a balanced pattern of living. Whatever be our philosophy of life, therefore, it is evident that nature intends us to live a balanced existence. It intends us to have more than one interest and more than one attitude. It also expects us to maintain properly the equipment which we have been given. It expects us to use the body with a degree of respect appropriate to its requirements. It expects us to administer the body through the powers of consciousness in a manner most useful to ourselves and most beneficial to others. Nature rewards this type of conduct, and it penalizes all other types. The moment the individual departs from a proper pattern, he endangers his own happiness and the security of those around him. This pattern, therefore, must consist of disciplined activity and rest. Disciplined activity is very rare here in the West also. Activity rapidly passes out of the control of the mind. The individual becomes pressured by certain drives within his own nature. And these drives seldom, if ever, reveal adequate judgment, thoughtfulness, or understanding. If, on the other hand, the person becomes discouraged, dejected, feels himself utterly and completely frustrated, he may lose most of his natural drives. As a result, he sinks deeper and deeper into a negative condition. And this negative condition is not one of quiet and passive contemplation. It is simply confusion, discord, leading ultimately to inertia or to the loss of hope, faith, and belief in himself and others. Behind nearly all systems which have endured in this world, there have been patterns. Patterns represent rules. They are the ways in which things can be most wisely used. When you buy an elaborate and expensive piece of equipment, you generally receive with it an instruction book. This instruction book tells you how to use it. It tells you how to notice defects in its functions. It warns you about the necessity of proper upkeep. And if the equipment is particularly complicated, it is not unusual for the manufacturer to provide a person to explain it to the purchaser, or even to cooperate with the operators of the machine until they become fully aware of its problems and its limitations. Man himself is probably the most important bit of machinery we know. And yet, for the most part, the person does not accept it, accept man, as in need of certain managerial directives. The individual feels himself to be entirely capable of guarding his own affairs simply because he exists. Now, several factors could contribute to the improvement of the present situation. We are deeply worried when one of our mechanical brains that we are inventing, one of these great computers, goes out of function. We know that it is a very costly problem, and that the errors resulting from improper function may put a heavy penalty upon the firm owning the machine. Thus, we are very careful with it, and we try to make sure that it operates correctly, and we turn its operation over to skilled and trained persons who know how to use it. For some reason, which undoubtedly is part of nature's plan, however, we turn the human body, which is a far more complicated instrument even than the great computer, we turn it over to an individual who does not understand it, who is seldom if ever willing to take lessons in the use of the machine, and who firmly believes that merely because he exists, he can administer this intricate mechanism with precision and efficiency. Facts show that these hopes are not well-founded. The individual working with his body down through the years is not a good engineer. is not able to handle the equipment effectively. Now, it is also practical to assume that out of perhaps 1,000,000 years of traditional experience, man should gradually become informed as to the proper way of managing this equipment, which is himself. Certainly, he has been given innumerable books of instruction, books written by scientists, by philosophers, by theologians, by mystics, by masters of ethics and logic. All different types of literature are available to help the individual understand himself. Today, however, we have no time for this literature. We are so anxious to get the machine into full production that we are not even willing to glance at the manual which accompanies it. We assume that by trial and error we shall come to proficiency. We do not, however, again find that these presumptions work out. In the study of man himself, therefore, we have to recognize the patterns which operate in his life. Without a proper understanding of these patterns, we cannot function to our own maximum efficiency. We cannot be the people we want to be. We become confused, disturbed, and finally drift off into some wrong procedure, which brings tragedy, disaster, or misery to us long before the natural wear and tear of life should disable us. In this world, the Oriental philosophies have pointed out one very valuable point, which I think we are all inclined to overlook, that in the study of man, we must also give some thought to the study of his mind. Very largely, the person today is mind-driven. Nearly everything that he does arises from his own mental processes. He develops attitudes, convictions, opinions, and beliefs which become the dominant forces in his characteristics. Yet he has really no understanding of what the mind really is. He is not at all certain as to the place of mind in the universal pattern of things. He has come to assume that mind represents the highest possible faculty that man can possess. And that the individual who is able to develop his mental resources by this means and this means alone attains security. Around us is gathering evidence that such is not the case. We are beginning to suspect that in some way we are leaning too heavily upon the mental faculty. We are demanding of it more than it can bestow. And as we study the mind more carefully, we discover that it is essentially an amoral factor. In other words, the mind itself does not naturally follow any broad pattern of ethics. The mind is a machine, in a sense, which under a skillful operator will produce much good. But if the mind is left to its own devices, like the machine, without adequate leadership, it will soon become an expensive and troublesome article. We have to do something to begin to analyze the power and limitation of mind. We have to begin to recognize that thoughts are not true because they are thoughts, that they are not good because they are thoughts, that the mind cannot be depended on by itself to achieve a permanent state of good for anyone. 25 years ago, such a statement would be considered either heresy or superstition. Today, however, the majority of human beings realize that the mind is the most dangerous thing in the world. That some way we have been given a two-edged sword. The mind provides us with the incentives and methods and arts and sciences which have enriched life. But the mind has then continued its procedure and gradually torn down the very structure that it built. Little by little, the mind destroys its own products, and through becoming a tyrant within the consciousness of the person, the mind leads him away from useful accomplishments to desperate extremes of thought and emotion. Perhaps one of the ways that we can best point this out has been the development in the worlds of science. Here we know that the mind is depended upon more heavily than in any other branch of human activity. Science is always regarded as the ultimate mental activity. It is regarded as the final proof of the magnificent ingenuity of the human being. It is also held that science is the principal custodian of those laws, principles, and policies by which man may ultimately attain to the final facts of existence. Thus, depending very heavily upon mind, building its entire structure upon the thoughts of brilliant leaders, technicians, and experimenters, science has gone on its way with the motive behind its action of applying the best of mental activity to the solution of the human problem. But what has happened? Instead of this ending in a magnificent structure of idealistic progress, we now observe that the scientific procedure is revealing all of the immorality of its own inevitable mental limitation. Science has shown to us that man can be a creative genius, but it has also revealed to all human beings that science does not make the man good. It makes him skillful, but it does not make him intuitive into the values of life. It presents him with innumerable opportunities to expand consciousness, but seldom follows any of the directives that are indicated. As a result of this, science, which could have and should have enriched us beyond all imaginable boundaries, has also confronted us with nuclear fission, has developed a constant increase in mechanistic machinery and devices which are facing us with a desperate labor unbalance. It is going on into the chemical fields to deluge us with medications, many of which are dangerous to the survival of the person. And also it has given us patterns of efficiency in which the natural requirements of the human being are ignored. Thus science, instead of giving us planned progress, has given us a tremendous boost towards mechanistic complication. It has threatened not only our peace of mind, but through atomic fission and nuclear fission, it has threatened our survival. Our only possible answer to this is that the mind which devised nuclear weapons cannot be essentially a moral mind. It cannot be a mind in which the great ideals of the race are securely protected. It cannot be a mind that is dedicated to the good of man. It can only be regarded as a mind dedicated to the expansion of its own ingenuity. A mind which, having the power to think, devise, and invent, continues this procedure without any acceptance of moral responsibility for the productions of its own abilities. Realizing then that this creative mind, as we call it, is not necessarily a good mind, that it is not necessarily a wise mind, that it is not a mind dedicated to beauty and to friendship and to truth and to idealism. It is a mind simply dedicated to the intricate processes of thought itself, and is emerging to our realization more as a machine than as an entity. In various fields of activity, we have attempted to develop psychological therapies to take care of the inconsistencies and destructive tendencies of the mind. We recognize mental sickness now more than ever before. But what we do not recognize is that mind, unguarded and unguided by some other superior power, must always produce sickness. It is simply not capable of a complete orientation by its own processes alone. Or if it is capable of such orientation, this capacity has never been adequately developed. As a result of the general situation, we find that the collective mentation of man in every area of life is resulting in continually unfolding insecurity. The world and the person are both now the victims of what might be termed mental brilliance. Not only of mental brilliance, but of mental blind pressures. We can hardly read a morning newspaper without realizing how countless persons are abusing their own mental resources, how nations are going contrary to common sense and justifying their contrariness by reference to their mental objectives. We must then finally concede that in our own nature, or in the nature of larger collectives, the mind cannot, of itself, by itself, be permitted to unfold the destiny of the individual unless to the mental process of skill be added certain overtones, certain controls, certain directives. The individual must be more than a skillful thinker. He must be intelligent in the truest sense of the word, and intelligence in its highest form is a regulator of conduct, not merely a discoverer of new facts. When new facts of themselves are discovered, many of them have ethical imponderables involved in them. The entire development of science has given to the world knowledge of the greatest ethical importance. Yet this knowledge is consistently ignored, especially if it interferes with the continuing development of man's mental images. Therefore, today we are faced with a decision which Western man has made, namely his entire willingness to, we will say, discredit or ignore ethics in the effort to free the way for the continual unfoldment of mental activity. He is gradually taking the position that morality is a restricting power upon mental creativity. Consequently, in order that the mind shall be free to continue its present course, we must remove or ignore all testimonies that this course is wrong. We must continue to be completely dedicated to the fact that thought is the most valuable thing in the world, particularly highly competitive thought, by means of which we are able to produce devices which will enable us to outwit our competitors in various areas of industry, economics, and politics. In the person's life, this tragedy comes home in a very much more intimate and difficult way. It is bad enough to live in a vast environment in which nobody seems to know what they are doing, why they are doing it, or where they are going. This in itself is a very depressing and very bewildering state of affairs. But when it finally takes over our own personal psychology, so that we no longer have any clear directives, we no longer have any definite patterns from which we operate. When this situation takes over, then the confusion becomes general in our personal lives. And as confusion is now the fashion, we assume that it is normal for us to be confused. It is not normal, but it is inevitable so long as we breed only confusion in our own way of life. Eastern philosophy, therefore, still presents us with this magnificent concept of cause and effect. That things which happen are due to causes. If our world is not secure, if war threatens in every part of human society, if leadership is inadequate, if the pressures of life are too great for the individual to bear, if life itself has become less and less interesting and important to the individual, these are all effects. These effects must have a cause, and this cause must be great enough and universal enough to explain and justify the effects which come from it. We cannot be doing the right thing. We cannot be moving in the direction intended for us to move. We cannot be cooperating with the plan for man in the universe, and at the same time be the victim of constant disaster, misery, sickness, and emotional pressure. All these different results have to be based upon the fact that we are breaking rules, that in some way we are failing to take into consideration the purposes and patterns for which man was devised. There is every reason to assume that man was so constructed that he might attain his purposes adequately, that his body, mind, and emotions were given to him to use but not abuse, and that if he uses them wisely, they will mature him and bring peace and security to his world. If he uses them unwisely, they will bring him finally to such conditions as we face today. We cannot, therefore, continue to hold the attitude that we are always right, that our patterns are right, that our systems are right, and that our methods are according to natural law. If all these different assumptions of right are revealed by experience as producing only misfortune, there has to be some relationship between the state we are in and the way we act. And until this relationship is clarified, and until we more or less return the guidance of our way of life to these natural laws and processes by which life is inevitably directed, until we therefore cease to be completely egocentric and begin to think in terms of the universal plan, we cannot remedy the ills which presently afflict us. There are no evasions to this situation. We live in a universe of laws, not accidents. Our troubles are the lawful results of our own conduct. And if this be more and more obvious to us, it is very unusual indeed, or almost incredible, that we can continue on our way, making the same mistakes, glorifying the same type of leadership, following the same traditional methods that have never resulted in security. Yet the moment we attempt to break through this pattern, we find that we are blocked by a certain kind of thinking, a thinking which is afraid, apparently, to question the policies which presently dominate our affairs. The individual is penalized for doubting the value of that which has already proved that it is not valuable. We are therefore forced into a continual perpetuation of false policies. Policies which we cannot hope will ever bring about the desired ends which we seek. To meet this emergency, to maintain some form of common sense within our own natures, we are compelled in one way or another to cause a kind of ethical revolution. Something has to be done to break the pattern. And each individual, realizing this, observes the futility of his own efforts. He finds that when it comes to trying to break this pattern, no one seems to care. That instead of the individual reaching a state of revolt against inadequacy, he is now gradually meeting a desperate situation with a passive helplessness, hopelessness, and numbness. Conditions which a few years ago would have resulted in an outbreak of public indignation are now passed over as just the inevitable circumstances of the times. We simply no longer attempt to put things right. We simply let them drift. We are unhappy, we are miserable, and as a result of that, polls that have been recently carried on in different parts of the country for various reasons indicate that more and more persons do not really care whether they are dead or alive. They admit this perfectly frankly. If a doctor tells a patient that his present conduct is going to take 10 years off his life, the patient says, so what? Who cares about the 10 years anyway? There'll just be more misery and high taxes. And instead of worrying about it, I'll do as I please now. This is becoming a general attitude. It is also a constant struggle between the impulse to fulfill desire and the realization that the thing desired may be dangerous or detrimental. If the desired thing brings immediate satisfaction, we have lost all concept of long-range consequences. We live almost completely for the moment, a situation that probably has been exaggerated again by the insecurity of world affairs. More and more we are content to try to have a little happiness or a little pleasure now. But each person, unfortunately, catches up with the consequences of this. And by the time he catches up with it, and is thoroughly miserable, he may not be able to make any adequate corrections. So we simply drift along with a reasonable certainty that we are going to land on the rocks. But we have a hope that the drifting will be pleasant until we hit the rocks. And then after the rocks have been hit, the ship has been sunk, and the passengers have been lost, there is no one left to complain. This type of thinking is becoming what might be termed the American way of life, and it is not good thinking. It is the passive acceptance of the objectionable. It is the individual compromising continuously with things which he knows are not right. Now we come to the individual under the pressure of these circumstances. He embodies most of the extremes and intemperances and inconsistencies which we have mentioned. And I have noticed more and more in recent years a trend which seems to be taking over in a great many areas and among many different levels of our people. And that is this process of being driven by the mind to the continuous fulfillment of instinct, whatever it may be at that moment. The individual is losing the power to have an idea and then say to himself, this is not a good idea, therefore I will not follow it. He is losing the power to say, this I want, but I cannot get it without compromising my ethics. In this moment, there is no longer any problem of weighing values. The individual goes for what he wants, regardless of consequences. There seems to be, therefore, little or no curb by character upon conduct. We simply do not seem to believe that we possess the courage to direct our own lives apart from our immediate interests. Thus we give the mind, which could help us to be anything we want to be, the absolute dictatorial right to tell us what we want to be. We allow the mind to evade and excuse and exonerate. We allow the mind to bewitch us in countless ways, and have the feeling in our own natures that it is absolutely impossible, unthinkable, that we should do anything we do not want to do, or that we should not do anything that we do want to do. There seems to be no interval between impulse and fulfillment. Every instinct must be catered to. Every instantaneous desire must be fulfilled. We are here simply to do as we please. The whole world is moving on this psychology and is moving nearer to chaos every moment. So we go back to Dr. Suzuki's basic thinking on this matter. Should we consider it possible for the individual to control himself? Should we consider it desirable? Certain schools of psychology tell us today that when we control ourselves, we become frustrated and neurotic. That the individual who wants to do something and doesn't do it will soon be sick. What they do not tell us, however, is that with most people, if they do what they want to do, they will soon be dead. This they do not get around to. We assume, therefore, that a constant extraversion of desire is the key to normalcy. We have been practicing it for 40 years and we're not normal. We are not anywhere near as well off with this complete liberty that we have today as some of the older generations in which such freedoms were rare if available at all. We are not nearly as happy as we would be if we had to occasionally sacrifice ourselves to the common good. The more we gratify, the more we are impelled to gratify. Our present way of life is habit forming, and we are developing very dangerous habits. Recognizing that these habits almost immediately begin to produce detrimental results, we find that the undisciplined and uncontrolled person is almost always in trouble. And to escape this kind of trouble, we are using every type of artificial means to try to escape the consequences of our own attitudes. When we make ourselves sick by our own conduct, we try to cure ourselves with sedations, Milltown, or barbiturates or something of this nature. We come to the conclusion that the only solution to our problem is to dull our conscience, to get rid of this nasty equation of consciousness within ourselves which tells us that what we are doing is not right. There is still a little conflict in some people between principle and practice. We are now assured that this conflict is the cause of sickness and that the solution is to get rid of principle. This is what it actually amounts to. We don't say it this way, but when we get down underneath the whole problem, we realize that when we are dissatisfied with ourselves, we take another drink and retire into the tranquility of unconsciousness. We do not meet the challenge of the power of man to create a proper destiny. We do not accept the fact that man is here to learn to control himself. Wherever civilization has clear and deep patterns of discipline, that civilization develops. The moment success or luxury or power cause the individual to lose his orientation in nature, these cultures slowly fade away. They descend into darkness simply because they have lost purpose, they have lost meaning, they have lost value. Trying to protect with wealth or influence a condition which can only be saved by integrity. So perhaps the Roman and the modern man of the West have certain parallels worth noting. Both utterly disillusioned, both having lost vigor, integrity, and dedication to a way of life, both existing in a system which they no longer really respect, and both trying to buy off the enemy. This is the situation that we have had to face, and it is the inevitable result of the decline of the person, the decline of the values in the individual. In the general problem as we see it today, there are several kinds of human beings that have emerged from the pressures which we know. One group, a rather forlorn one, has lost nearly all of its directives. It is composed almost totally of drifters, individuals not actually ill-minded, not desirous of doing wrong, but rather unable to face the mounting collective pressure around them. They are being drowned in a sea of circumstances over which they have no power of leadership. They are not able to swim. The waters rise, but they have never learned to swim. For in this problem of ethics, the swimmer is the individual whose own internal skills are greater than circumstance, whose hopes and ideals and principles are strong enough to carry him through a natural disaster. This type of person can swim against the flood. But today there are many who simply cannot maintain any standard because of the pressures being great and their own internal resources being very slight. Now, how does it happen that the best educated, most progressive nation in the world can produce at this time 25 or 50 million people with no essential standard of living? How has it been possible that the way in which we have developed our civilization could result today in an enormous mass of hopelessness, a kind of psychological skid row, populated by people who are broken-hearted, weak-minded, worn out, discouraged, disillusioned, frightened, and generally desolated? What is the kind of world that has permitted this to happen? Why have we today more and more persons who are giving up the fight, allowing themselves to simply drift in whatever course of circumstances may prevail, with only one consolation, namely that it is not very easy to starve to death in this country? There will be a certain financial protection. They will have what they have to exist. And this becomes the one hope that seems to remain to these people. Then we have another group that under the pressures of these circumstances turns aggressively belligerent. This is the type of group that from various motivations, arising largely from neurosis, are out championing and fighting causes without any basic consideration for ethics in their own battle. These people are not really fighting essentially to put better principles into action. This is the excuse, but the real excuse is that the individual finds a certain kick from violence, from aggressiveness, and from ignoring the common rules of life in order to force some point of his own. We have in this group innumerable juvenile delinquents. We have in it this type of individual who is always associating himself with violent causes, simply because he has come to the conclusion that violence is a proof of his own aliveness, that if he is out fighting and perhaps dying for a cause, he is a person. It is very difficult to understand why, with all the background of culture which we assume we possess, that we are not able to produce causes which are themselves ethically suitable, morally right, and can be attained by proper ethical and moral means, as though that it is not necessary for man to achieve peace by destroying his adversary. This type of thinking also burdens millions of people, and there seems to be no ethical directives, by means of which these persons are impelled to always operate creatively, constructively, and ethically. They take the attitude, of course, that there is no possibility of an ethical approach to these problems. Therefore, violence is inevitable. Actually, no ethical effort has really been made. A few, yes, but the majority have not attempted to live a pattern which would solve the problem. They are rather depending upon all kinds of excessive attitude for results which should have been gained by positive, creative, ethical means. And because so many of these projects are being fought out on an amoral level, only further cause of trouble is being created. Then we have the individual who is largely a private citizen without any great public causes, who is simply unable to get along with himself, who finds it almost impossible to meet the ordinary daily challenge and pressure. Of this kind we have every possible level. We have individuals with every grievance that it is imaginable that man can hold. We are overwhelmed with negative dissatisfaction. Something must be done about something, but very few individuals include in the work of reconstruction any major transformation of themselves. Everything is turned outward into society. If we can get better political leadership, we'll be happy. If we can get stronger pills, we can rest. If we have higher commodity sales, we will have more prosperity. Everything depending upon the continual unfoldment of this amoral scientific economic procedure, with the individual becoming less and less significant in the pattern which he himself is building and trying to support. It has therefore reached the state in which the structure he is building is demanding more from him than he can give, and is also endangering his peace of mind, his health, and his security. What keeps driving people's thoughts the way they are driven today? Why are people actually wandering about the world dominated by delusions? How does it happen that we can wreck our lives and very often wreck other people's lives by the desperate determination to do things that are not right, to hold attitudes that are not productive, and to deceive ourselves into a state that almost approaches mental unbalance? Why is it that the average person has gradually developed within himself a pattern of unhappiness which he cannot break through, which closes in upon him, and which ultimately leads him and those he cares for into the most serious and terrible consequences? It's very hard to know why these things happen, but we know the underlying reason behind the situation itself. It is extremely simple. Nearly every individual whose mind is deceiving him, who is not able to control himself, is undisciplined. We go back into the lives of these people, and we find one of two circumstances almost inevitably. One is that these individuals came from disordered homes. They came from an environment in which, for one reason or another, they were never taught from the beginning that life was a responsibility which they had to carry with dignity. They were never taught to control their own thoughts, control their own emotions. They were never under what might be termed a reasonable amount of discipline. This lack of discipline was due perhaps to indifference on the part of parents, perhaps due to the absolute selfishness of parents, and sometimes, no doubt, to the incredible ignorance of parents as to what was right and proper. it is impossible to bring up a person in this world to maturity without that person learning self-discipline and not have some form of delinquency follow. So one group of persons simply is the product of never being taught to control themselves, never being taught obedience, never being taught to be integrated into a social group. Furthermore, this type of individual was not helped by education, which should have contributed to some form of orientation. The undisciplined person can graduate with the highest scholastic honors and still remain essentially undisciplined. He gains a certain amount of scholastic discipline. He is told to sit at the desk and answer the questions. He is made to listen. He has to attend classes regularly. He has to do a certain amount of work or he will not graduate. These types of disciplines he does get, and in the course of time he becomes very rebellious of most of them. But all these disciplines fit him finally for only one phase of his later life, and that is that in the future he must perhaps sit at a desk for 30 years, whether he likes it or not. This he learns to do. But it does not make him appreciate what he is doing, it does not give him pride in his work, and it does not give him any wealth of character. It merely means to him that he is the victim of an industrial or economic system, and that if he does not stay at this desk, he will not have a paycheck. That is the extent of the ethics involved in the situation. There are exceptions, of course, of individuals with self-pride and self-understanding who do better, but the great trend is in this direction. Without discipline, therefore, the person reaching maturity is bound to have the worst of all bad habits. And that worst of all bad habits is the tendency to simply do as he wants to do without ever recognizing any common responsibility.